Ronald Newsom sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian. The silence of his 80-floor penthouse, so thick it felt like physical pressure. Outside, the Chicago skyline was a jagged crown of glass and light, but Ronald's eyes were fixed on the small, rectangular slip of paper resting in the center of his blotter. It was a check for exactly $1,000 to the world. Ronald was a titan of industry, a man whose signature could move markets and dismantle competitors with a single stroke of a pen. But to himself, in this private hour of the month, he was merely a man trying to pay an unpayable debt. The ritual had not changed in 7,305 days. He picked up his fountain pen, the gold nib catching the dim light of the office, and felt the familiar phantom ache in his chest. 20 years had passed since Maya's breath had hitched and stored in that sterile hospital room. Yet the memory was as vivid as the ink on the page. He could still hear her whisper, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement, begging him to look after her mother, Martha. At the time, Ronald had been a rising star with more ambition than capital, but he had sworn a blood oath that Martha would never know the sting of poverty. He signed his name with a practiced, fluid motion, a signature that usually authorized multi-billion-dollar acquisitions, now tethered to a promise that felt heavier than his entire empire. This monthly $1,000 was a drop in the ocean of his net worth, a rounding error in his daily earnings. Yet it was the only part of his wealth that still felt tethered to his soul. He lived in a world of gold-plated faucets and private jets, a life designed to insulate him from the grit of the reality he and Maya had once shared. But every time he slipped this check into an envelope addressed to 412 Oak Street, he felt the cold walls of his grief closing in. He hadn't seen Martha in over a decade. It was his deepest flaw, a secret shame he buried under layers of corporate conquest. Looking at Martha was like looking at a fractured mirror of Maya. The same tilt of the head, the same softness in the eyes that reminded him of everything he had lost and everything his money couldn't buy back. He convinced himself that the money was enough, that the checks provided a fortress of security for the woman who had raised his soulmate. He was a billionaire, a hero of capitalism. But in the quiet of his obsidian desk, he realized he had been using his wealth as a shield to keep the past at bay. The envelope sat there, white and unassuming against the black stone. It represented his duty, his loyalty, and his prison. For 20 years, he had operated on the assumption that as long as the checks were cashed, the world was in balance. He had delegated the care of Martha to his accountants and assistants, turning a sacred promise into a line item on a spreadsheet. He reached out to press the intercom button to summon his secretary, but his hand hesitated. A strange, cold intuition pricked at the back of his neck, a feeling like a faulty wire sparking in the dark. Something about the silence of the room felt wrong this month, as if the gold-plated life he had built was beginning to vibrate with an invisible tension. He looked at the address, 412 Oak Street, and for the first time in 20 years, the distance between his penthouse and that modest suburban door felt like a gulf he could no longer ignore. The stillness of the obsidian office was shattered the following morning by the sharp click of heels against polished marble. Marcus, Ronald's senior executive assistant, a man whose primary function was to filter the unpleasantness of reality before it reached the billionaire's ears, entered with a stack of documents tucked under his arm. Ronald didn't look up from his monitor. He was tracking a merger in Tokyo, his mind a labyrinth of numbers and logistical forecasts. Yet he noticed the slight hesitation in Marcus's rhythm, a microscopic hitch that suggested a secret was being carried into the room. "The quarterly reports for the Newsom Foundation are ready for your review, sir," Marcus said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. He laid a leather-bound folder on the desk. But as he pulled his hand away, Ronald noticed a stray piece of mail, partially obscured beneath Marcus's sleeve. It was a standard white envelope, but it bore the aggressive, stamped ink of the United States Postal Service. Return to sender, vacant. Ronald's hand shot out, pinning the envelope to the desk before Marcus could slide it into his pocket. The assistant froze, his face a mask of professional neutrality that was beginning to crack at the edges. Ronald pulled the letter toward him and felt a sudden sickening drop in his stomach. It was the check from the previous month, the $1,000 intended for $400. Why is this on my desk and not in Martha's mailbox? Marcus, Ronald asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency. Marcus cleared his throat, his eyes darting toward the window. It appears to be a clerical error at the post office. I've already instructed the legal team to look into it. There's no need for you to concern yourself with it. We'll have a courier deliver a replacement to the estate office immediately. Ronald looked at the envelope again. The vacant stamp wasn't a clerical error. It was a diagnostic report of a life he had ignored. He looked at Marcus and saw, for the first time, the subtle shiftiness he usually only recognized in his corporate enemies. The assistant was trying to hide the truth, acting as a buffer, not to protect Ronald's grief, but to keep him from looking too closely at a connection that had supposedly been maintained for 20 years. The estate office. Ronald repeated, the words tasting like ash. Martha doesn't have an estate office. She has a house with a porch and a garden Maya used to talk about. Of course, sir. Marcus replied quickly. Perhaps too quickly. I meant the management firm that handles her property. It's all part of the automated system we set up years ago. Truly, sir. You have a board meeting in 10 minutes regarding the acquisition. This is a distraction you don't need. But the faulty wire Ronald had felt the night before was now glowing white hot. He realized that by turning his promise into an automated system, he had created a blind spot large enough for a conspiracy to thrive. He stood up, ignored the leather-bound reports, and grabbed his suit jacket. Cancel the board meeting, Ronald commanded, walking past a stunned Marcus. Sir, you can't be serious. Millions are on the line, Marcus stammered, following him toward the private elevator. Ronald stopped at the elevator doors and turned, his gaze piercing through the assistant's carefully curated facade. For 20 years, I've let millions be the priority. Today, I'm going to see why a dead woman's mother is being ghosted by the post office. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Ronald felt the first stirrings of a cold billionaire rage. A realization that the connection he thought was built on gold was actually fraying into nothingness. The drive from the glass and steel heart of the city to the suburban fringes of Illinois felt like a descent through layers of history Ronald had long ago tried to bury. He drove himself, the hum of his high-performance engine sounding out of place on streets where the asphalt was cracked and the streetlights flickered with neglected age. By the time he turned onto Oak Street, the prestigious scent of his leather interior felt like an insult to the stagnant air of a neighborhood that time had forgotten. He pulled the car to a stop in front of Fort Wayne, and the breath left his lungs as if he'd been struck. The house didn't just look empty. It looked dead. The structure in front of him was a skeleton of the home Maya had described in her story. The windows were boarded up with graying plywood, and the yard was a waist-high jungle of yellowed weeds and aggressive vines that were slowly strangling the porch. The address numbers 412 were crooked and rusted, hanging by a single screw like a broken lid. This was the place he had been funding for 2 decades. This was the sanctuary he believed his $1,000 checks were maintaining. Ronald stepped out of the car, his bespoke Italian shoes crunching on the gravel and broken glass of the driveway. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic thud of a loose shutter banging against the siding. He walked toward the porch, his mind racing through 20 years of bank statements and property maintenance fees his board had approved without question. If the house was a ruin, where had the money gone? If the house was vacant, where was Martha? You're about 10 years too late if you're looking to buy, and 20 years too late if you're looking for a friend. The voice was raspy, seasoned by decades of smoke and disappointment. Ronald turned to see a woman standing on the edge of the adjacent property. She was dressed in a worn, floral patterned shirt, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her hair was a messy nest of gray, and her eyes, deep-set and suspicious, locked onto Ronald with a visceral intensity. She looked exactly like the neighborhood, hardened, weathered, and entirely unimpressed by his expensive suit. "I'm looking for Martha Jefferson," Ronald said, his voice sounding hollow in the open air. I'm a relative." The woman let out a dry, hacking laugh that ended in a cough. "Relative?" Martha didn't have relatives. She had a daughter, who died, and a son-in-law who became a ghost. For years she sat on that porch, waiting for a car that looked like yours to pull up. It never did. Ronald felt the words like a physical blow to the solar plexus. "I sent money, every month. I was told the house was being taken care of." The neighbor stepped closer, her eyes narrowing, as she took in the details of his face. Recognition flickered in her expression, followed quickly by a flash of pure, unadulterated anger. "You're him, aren't you? The billionaire. The one Maya married." She spat on the dry ground between them. "Your money didn't do a damn thing for her, Newsom. About 5 years ago the suits showed up. They didn't look like bankers, they looked like They told Martha she didn't own the deed anymore, that it had been transferred to some corporate holding company. They packed her life into 3 cardboard boxes and put her in the back of a black sedan while she was still crying for Maya." "Who?" Ronald stepped toward her, the billionaire's command returning to his voice, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Which company? Who took her?" "They had your company's logo on their folders," the woman said, her voice dropping to a low, accusatory hiss. "Newsom Global. Your people." They told the neighborhood they were moving her to a premier care facility befitting her status. "But I saw where that car went, Mr. Newsom. It didn't go to the North Shore. It went south, toward the industrial district, where the buildings don't have names, only numbers. They didn't take her to a home. They took her to hide her." Ronald looked back at the boarded-up house, the vacant stamp from the post office, now echoing in the emptiness of the windows. He realized then that his board hadn't just been embezzling his money. They had been erasing his life, turning his mother-in-law into a liability they could tuck away in the shadows, so he wouldn't have a reason to look back. He turned back to the neighbor, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. "Where exactly did they take her?" The woman stared at him for a long beat, measuring the sincerity in his eyes. Finally she sighed, the anger giving way to a weary pity. "I kept the flyer they dropped, some place called the Riverview Inn. It sounds nice, but it's a warehouse for people the world wants to forget. If you really are who Maya said you were, you'll go get her, because she's been waiting 20 years for you to be more than a signature on a check." As Ronald climbed back into his car, the luxury of the interior now felt like a tomb. He wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a man who had realized he was the architect of his own betrayal. He shifted the car into gear, the tires spinning on the gravel as he turned away from the ghost of 4th Oak Street, heading toward the industrial heart of the city, to find the woman he had abandoned to his own shadow. The industrial district of Chicago felt like a different planet, a landscape of rusted iron and windowless concrete that swallowed the sunlight. Ronald sat in the back of his darkened limousine, the glow of a tablet illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He hadn't returned to the office. He couldn't. Every floor of Newsom Global now felt like enemy territory. Instead, he had placed a single call to Elias Thorne, a man whose career existed in the digital gutters and financial shadows, a private investigator who specialized in unmaking the powerful. Thorne sat opposite him, a laptop perched on his knees, his fingers dancing across the keys with a frantic rhythmic energy. The air in the car was cool, but the data streaming across the screen was explosive. For years, Ronald had operated on trust and delegation, assuming that his inner circle shared his reverence for the past. Now he watched as Thorne systematically dismantled that illusion, peeling back the layers of Newsom Legacy Holdings, the shell company Ronald had authorized decades ago to manage Martha's welfare. "It's a masterpiece of financial camouflage, Newsom," Thorne muttered, his eyes reflected in the screen's blue light. "Your monthly $1,000 check wasn't just a payment, it was a trigger of every time that check was cut from your private account, it authorized a secondary transfer from the Newsom Global General Fund,
a matching grant for charitable elder care. But it wasn't $1,000, it was $1 million. Ronald felt a vain pulse in his temple. $1 million. Every month, $12 million a year for 20 years, Thorne confirmed, his voice devoid of emotion. The math is staggering. $240 million moved through a series of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, all tied back to a Martha Jefferson Foundation. On paper, you were the greatest philanthropist in the history of elder care. In reality, that money was being siphoned off by 3 specific members of your board. They used Martha's existence as a human shield. As long as she was alive and tucked away in a place where no one could talk to her, the faucet stayed open. Ronald leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight. He had built an empire on the ability to read people, yet he had been blind to the vipers in his own net. He thought of the boarded-up house on Oak Street and the woman in the floral shirt. His board had effectively turned his grief into a business model, monetizing a dead woman's memory to fund their yachts and penthouses, while the woman he had promised to protect was living in a warehouse. The signatures on the property transfers, Ronald said, his voice a low vibrating growl. Who authorized the eviction? Thorne tapped a final key and turned the screen toward Ronald. 3 digital documents appeared, each bearing a signature that Ronald knew as well as his own. Arthur Vance, the CFO, Sarah Jenkins, the head of legal, and Marcus, the very man who had tried to hide the returned letter that morning. They hadn't just stolen money. They had forged Ronald's own name on the documents that stripped Martha of her home, making it appear as though Ronald himself had ordered her removal. They made me the villain in her story, Ronald whispered, the realization cutting deeper than the financial theft. They didn't just steal the money, sir, Thorne added, pointing to a recent wire transfer. They've been liquidating the Foundation's remaining assets over the last 48 hours. They knew the returned check was a leak in the dam. They're preparing to vanish. Ronald looked out the window at the passing gray walls of the district. The anger he felt was no longer a hot, impulsive flash. It had crystallized into something cold, hard, and permanent. He was a billionaire, a man of immense resources, and he had spent 20 years being a victim of his own detachment. He watched as the GPS tracker on the tablet signaled they were nearing the Riverview, and the board thought they had won because they understood money. But they had forgotten that Ronald Newsom had started with nothing but a promise, and a man who has nothing to lose is the most dangerous predator in the market. Keep digging, Thorne, Ronald commanded, his eyes fixed on the looming, windowless structure ahead. I want every account frozen, every property lined, and every secret they've ever kept laid bare. If they wanted to play with my legacy, I'm going to make sure they have nothing left to inherit but the ruins. The limousine slowed to a crawl as it approached a chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. This was the premier care facility his board had described. Ronald stepped out into the humid, soot-heavy air, the obsidian-like focus in his eyes more piercing than the midday sun. He wasn't there to sign a check anymore. He was there to settle the bill. The 80th floor of the Newsom Global headquarters felt like a vacuum. As Ronald stepped off the private elevator, the air was pressurized, filtered, and smelled of expensive citrus and hidden agenda. He adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the glass corridor, his face a mask of impenetrable marble. To anyone watching, he was the same detached titan they had seen for 2 decades, the man who lived in the clouds and left the terrestrial details to his subordinate. But beneath the skin of his bespoke suit, Ronald was a hunter, entering a den of vipers, and he could feel the venom in the air. Marcus was waiting by the mahogany doors of the executive suite, a tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. He looked up, his eyes darting across Ronald's face, searching for a trace of the storm that had broken at the Riverview Annex. Sir, thank God you're back, Marcus said, his voice smooth but pitched a semitone too high. The board is already in the conference room. They're concerned about the cancelled meeting this morning. I told them it was a minor health flare-up, nothing to worry the investors about. Thoughtful of you, Marcus, Ronald replied, his voice a cool, steady drawl. He walked past his assistant, into his office, not pausing to look at the framed photo of Maya. He didn't need the photo anymore. He had the real Martha tucked away in a high-security medical suite, across town, guarded by men who took orders only from. Tell the board, I'll be with them in 10 minutes. I need to sign off on the charitable disbursements first. Marcus lingered in the doorway, his posture stiff. Of course, sir. But Arthur Vance mentioned that the signature for the Jefferson Foundation needs to be handled through the digital portal today. Security protocols, you understand? I understand perfectly, Ronald said, sitting behind his obsidian desk and opening his laptop. Close the door on your way out. The moment the latch clicked, Ronald's fingers flew across the keyboard. He wasn't looking at charitable disbursements. He was accessing the back end of the company's legal server using a bypass code Elias Thorne had provided an hour ago. He moved through the directories with predatory efficiency, bypassing the standard folders until he found the restricted archive labeled Project Sunset. There it was, a digitized folder containing the forged power of attorney documents used to strip Martha of her home and her right. He opened the primary file and felt a surge of cold fire in his gut. The signature at the bottom was a masterpiece of forgery. It looked exactly like his own, right down to the slight tremor in the final E. But as he zoomed in on the metadata of the scan, the truth was laid bare. The document had been created and digitally signed using a corporate override key belonging to Arthur Vance, and the timestamp matched a day. Ronald had been in a coma-like state of grief on the 19th anniversary of Maya's death.
He didn't just find the forgery. He found the trail of breadcrumbs they had left in their arrogance. There were emails between Marcus and Sarah Jenkins, the head of legal, discussing the disposal of property at 412 Oak Street. One message from Sarah chilled him to the bone. The old woman is becoming a liability. If Newsom ever snaps out of it, we need her in a place where her word means nothing. The annex has a quiet room policy. Ronald felt the bile rise in his throat, but he didn't falter. He began downloading the entire directory to an encrypted drive, watching the progress bar crawl with agonizing slowness. He could hear the muffled sounds of the board members laughing in the adjacent room, the sound of people who thought they had successfully outrun a ghost. They were discussing the acquisition, the stock prices, and the millions they were about to move into their private accounts, oblivious to the fact that the man they had spent 20 years gaslighting was currently dismantling their escape routes. The sharp knock at the door made his heart hammer against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of iron. 10 minutes are up, sir, Marcus's voice called through the wood. Coming, Ronald said, his voice a calm, lethal whisper. He yanked the encrypted drive from the port, just as the download finished, and slipped it into his pocket. He stood up, smoothed the front of his jacket, and took a slow, deep breath. He had the evidence. He had the name. He had the history of every dollar they had stolen from a dead woman's memory and a living woman's dignity. As he walked toward the boardroom, he realized that for 20 years, he had been the one being managed, the one being kept in a cage of his own making. But as he pushed open the double doors and saw the vipers sitting around the long glass table, their smiles faltering at the sheer cold intensity of his presence, Ronald knew the cage was finally open, and he wasn't leaving until the room was empty. The medical suite Ronald had secured for Martha was a cathedral of quiet technology, a sharp contrast to the damp concrete of the annex. Martha sat propped up against silk pillows, the color slowly returning to her parchment-thin skin. Ronald sat beside her, the encrypted drive still heavy in his pocket, but his mind was occupied by a different kind of weight. He had expected Martha to be grateful, or perhaps still angry, but instead she looked at him with a profound, lingering pity that made his billionaire status feel like a hollow costume. "You think this was just about money, don't you, Ronald?" Martha asked, her voice stronger now, though it still carried the rasp of the basement air. She reached out and touched the photograph of Maya that Ronald had brought from his desk. "You think they saw an opportunity after she died and took it. But Maya wasn't just a victim of a tragedy. She was a witness." Ronald leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "A witness to what?" "Maya was sick, Martha. She spent her final months in and out of clinics." Martha shook her head slowly, a sad smile touching her lips. "She wasn't just sick, Ronald. She was scared. In those last few months, when you were out building this empire, pulling 20-hour days to provide for a future she knew she wouldn't see, she started noticing things." He was the one who handled the early accounts, when you were just a startup in a garage. She knew the DNA of Newsome Global better than anyone, especially Arthur Vance and Sarah Jenkins. Ronald felt a cold prickle of dread. He remembered Maya's last weeks. She had been frantic, often clutching her laptop or whispering about discrepancies and safety net. He had attributed it to the fever, to the medication, to the natural anxiety of a woman facing the end. He had told her to rest, promised her that Arthur and the board would handle everything, and that she didn't need to worry about the business. He had essentially silenced her with his own protective arrogance. She found the first set of offshore accounts, Martha continued, her eyes fixed on the distant skyline. She realized that Arthur was setting up a parasitic structure within the company, siphoning off the initial public offering funds. She tried to tell you, Ronald. Do you remember the night she called you 3 times during the London merger? You didn't pick up because you were on the verge of history. She came to me that night crying. She said, Mama, if something happens to me, Ronald won't see them coming. He's looking at the sun, and they're the shadows at his feet. Ronald's breath hitched. He remembered that night vividly. He had been so proud of that merger, so certain that he was securing Maya's legacy. He had ignored her calls, thinking they were just the product of a lonely, grieving heart. She tried to leave a trail, Martha whispered. She told me she had hidden the original ledgers, the ones with the real signatures, in the crawl space of the Oak Street house. She made me promise not to tell you unless you woke up. She knew that if she told you while you were still blinded by the board's flattery, they would find a way to destroy the evidence, or worse, they would convince you she was losing her mind. She wanted to protect you from the truth until you were ready to hear it. Martha reached into the small velvet bag she had kept clutched to her chest since the annex. She pulled out a tarnished brass key, its bow engraved with a small M. She gave me this. It's for a safe deposit box she opened in my name, a week before she went into the hospital. She told me it contained the insurance you would need to take the company back. Ronald took the key, the metal feeling freezing against his palm. The board hadn't just exploited his grief. They had exploited Maya's death to bury the very evidence she had died trying to give him. They had moved Martha to the annex, not just to steal the monthly checks, but to ensure that the woman holding the key to their destruction was kept in a state of perpetual silence and perceived senility. She loved you enough to try to save you from your own success, Martha said, her hand squeezing his. She knew your heart was good, but she knew your pride was a blindfold. Every month you sent that money, you thought you were keeping a promise, but the real promise you made her was to be the man she believed in, not a man who hides in a glass tower, but a man who fights for the truth. Ronald stood up, the key clutched so tightly, it bit into his skin. The board meeting was still fresh in his mind, their smug faces a gallery of betrayal. They didn't just steal $200 million. They had effectively participated in the silencing of his wife's final act of love. He realized now that Maya hadn't died in a state of peaceful surrender. She had died in a state of war, protecting him from the very people he had invited into their lives. He looked at Martha, the woman who had carried this secret through poverty and isolation, through the basement damp and the quiet rooms of the annex. She was the true guardian of the Newsome legacy. Rest now, Martha, Ronald said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. I have the drive, I have the key, and I finally have my eyes open. Maya didn't just leave me a memory. She left me a weapon, and I'm going to make sure they feel every bit of it. As he walked out of the suite, Ronald Newsome was no longer just a billionaire mourning a loss. He was a man possessed by a 20-year-old justice. The vipers in the boardroom thought they were waiting for a businessman. They had no idea they were waiting for an executioner. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a sound like a guillotine blade drop. Inside, the air was thick with the ozone of panic. Arthur Vance was on his feet, 3 phones lined up on the glass table like miniature tombstones, while Sarah Jenkins was frantically whispering into a headset. Marcus sat at the far end, his face the color of wet ash, staring at a tablet that showed the Newsome Global stock ticker bleeding red into the dark. They were trapped in the wreckage of a morning they couldn't understand, surrounded by the luxury they had stolen, unaware that the architect of their ruin was standing in the doorway. Ronald didn't take his seat at the head of the table. He walked to the center of the room, his presence pulling the oxygen out of the air. The board members froze. Arthur was the first to find his voice, though it was thin and brittle. Ronald, thank God, we've had a catastrophic market event, some kind of algorithmic attack. We need to issue a buyback statement immediately or the margins will. The margins are gone, Arthur, Ronald said, his voice a low, lethal calm that silenced the room more effectively than a shout. The banks aren't calling to help you. They're calling to seize your home. He walked to the main console at the front of the room and slid the encrypted drive into the port. The massive 4K monitors, which usually displayed global logistics and profit margins, flickered and then filled with a grainy, high-contrast image of a boarded-up house. 420 years, Ronald said, his gaze moving from face to face, lingering on Marcus, until the assistant looked away. I paid you to protect a legacy. I paid you to honor a memory. Instead, you turned my grief into a line item. You turned a mother's life into an embezzlement scheme. He tapped a key. The speakers, designed for crystal-clear teleconferencing, filled the room with the raspy, accusatory voice of the neighbor from Oak Street. They told Martha she didn't own the deed anymore. They packed her life into 3 cardboard boxes. I saw where that car went, Mr. Newsom. It went toward the industrial district. The board members sat in a stunned, suffocating silence. Sarah Jenkins began to pack her briefcase with trembling hands. But Ronald didn't stop. He played the audio of the PI's findings. A clinical narration of the $240 million moved through the Martha Jefferson Foundation. Then he played the recording of Marcus and Diane Jefferson's extortion attempt. You thought I was weak because I was broken, Ronald said, stepping closer to Arthur, who looked as though he were physically shrinking into his expensive leather chair. You thought that because I lived in the clouds I wouldn't notice you digging graves in the dirt. But Maya saw you. She saw you 20 years ago. He brought up the final document from the safe deposit box, the ledger in Maya's own hand, detailing the very first theft Arthur had ever committed. Beside it he displayed the metadata of the forged power of attorney, showing Arthur's digital footprint all over the crime. The FBI is currently at the review annex, Ronald stated, his words falling like lead weights. They've already secured the quiet room. They've already frozen the offshore accounts Thorne identified. You didn't just fail a billionaire today. You failed a man who has nothing left to lose but his shadow. Marcus stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Ronald, please. You were just finished. Ronald interrupted. He didn't look at them as the security team he had personally hired. Not the company's security, but his own. Entered the room. Police are in the lobby. You won't be leaving through the private elevator. You'll be leaving through the front door in front of the cameras, so the world can see exactly what a traitor looks like. As the guards moved in to escort the board members out, Ronald turned his back on them. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he had conquered. But for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking through the glass, toward the horizon where Martha was waiting. The showdown was over. The Vipers were gone. The only thing left in the room was the truth. And for Ronald Newsom, that was more than enough. The sirens had long since faded into the hum of the city, and the glass tower of Newsom Global stood silent, a hollow monument to a life Ronald no longer recognized as his own. He had spent 48 hours signing away the chairmanship, appointing a trustee to dismantle the corporate structure that had become a breeding ground for vipers, and liquidating enough assets to ensure that every resident of the review annex was moved into proper, dignified care. The world was screaming for a statement, for an interview, for a glimpse of the billionaire, who had intentionally created his own stock to achieve justice. But Ronald Newsom was nowhere to be found. He was in the one place he had avoided for 2 decades. The sprawling, quiet estate on the North Shore that he and Maya had bought when they first tasted success. It was a house built for a family that never came to be, a place of echoing hallways and dust-covered memory. But today the heavy drapes were pulled back, and the smell of jasmine and sea salt replaced the sterile scent of corporate air filtration. Martha sat on a wrought iron bench at the edge of the manicured lawn, overlooking the gray-blue expanse of Lake Michigan. She was wrapped in a thick cream-colored cardigan, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the water met the sky. Ronald approached her slowly, carrying 2 cups of tea, his pace no longer dictated by the frantic rhythm of a ticking clock. He wore a simple sweater and jeans. The obsidian desk version of himself had been left behind in the ruins of the boardroom.
He sat down beside her, the bench creaking softly under their weight. For a long time neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rhythmic lap of the waves against the shore and the distant call of a gull. The silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating pressure of his office. It was a living thing. A space shared by two people who had finally stopped running from the same ghost. She always loved the water, Martha said softly, her voice no longer a raspy reed but a gentle melody. She used to say that the lake was the only thing in Chicago that didn't care how much money you had. It just was. Ronald looked at the steam rising from his cup. I spent 20 years trying to build a world she would be proud of. Martha, I thought if I made the name Newsom big enough, it would somehow fill the hole she left behind. I was so busy building the monument that I forgot to look after the person she actually loved. Martha turned to him, her eyes bright and clear, reflecting a wisdom that had survived the annex and the shadows. Maya didn't want a monument, Ronald. She wanted a partner, and she knew that one day you'd have to stop being a billionaire and start being her husband again. It just took a long time for the noise to quiet down enough for you to hear her. Ronald reached into his pocket and pulled out the small tarnished brass key, the one Maya had left in the safe deposit box. He looked at it, then reached out and took Martha's hand, pressing the key into her palm. I'm done with the checks, Martha. I'm done with the systems. Newsom Global is a ghost story now. I've stepped down. The lawyers are handling the rest. Martha closed her fingers over the key, a look of profound relief washing over her face. And what will you do now, Ronald? A man like you aren't built for sitting still. Ronald leaned back, looking up at the vast open sky. He thought of the 20 years he had spent in a cage of his own making, sending $1,000 a month to buy a peace of mind he never truly achieved. He thought of the board members in their cells and the neighbor on Oak Street. Most of all, he thought of Maya, not as a tragedy, but as the woman who had loved him enough to lead him away back to the truth. I think I'm going to learn how to be a son, Ronald said, his voice steady and warm. I think I'm going to sit on this bench and listen to you tell me every story about her that I was too busy to hear. I want to know about the things she liked before she met me. I want to know what made her laugh when she was a girl. I want to know the Maya I didn't try to buy a future for. Martha leaned her head against his shoulder, a long, weary sigh escaping her. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the colors of a new beginning. The $1,000 checks had stopped. The empire had been dismantled, and the billion-dollar routine was dead. But as the first stars began to blink over the lake, Ronald Newsom finally understood the real legacy his wife had left him. It wasn't the money, the tower, or the power. It was the quiet, the connection, and the courage to finally come home.